The ER clock was ticking, 8 minutes left. That's how long the doctors said the patient had before permanent damage set in. The room was crowded with specialists, monitors screaming, voices overlapping, but no one had an answer. They tried everything by the book. Then the ER nurse at the edge of the room spoke up. Not loudly, not dramatically, just one calm observation. The doctors ignored her, so she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, broke protocol, and acted. What happened next unfolded so fast the room went silent. The alarms changed. The patient responded. And the same doctors who had dismissed her seconds earlier stood frozen, staring at the monitor like it had betrayed them. Because in just 8 minutes, the nurse had done what hours of expertise couldn't. And the question no one wanted to ask suddenly became unavoidable. Why didn't they see it first? Before we continue, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The ER never warned you before it exploded. 1 second it hummed with controlled chaos, monitors beeping, phones ringing, stretchers rolling, and the next it shifted, like the air itself tightened. At 9:42 p.m. that shift hit Mercy Valley Emergency Department hard. Trauma coming in 5 minutes out. The announcement echoed overhead, sharp and urgent. Doctors straightened. Nurses moved faster. The calm that came from routine evaporated instantly. Nurse Lee Morgan glanced up from the medication cart. She didn't rush. She never did. She simply closed the drawer she was organizing, locked it, and turned toward the trauma bay. Lee had worked ER nights for 9 years. She was 34, slim, unassuming, and so quiet that new residents sometimes mistook her for a student. Her badge said registered nurse. Nothing else announced her experience. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't loud, but she noticed patterns. That was her edge. The ambulance doors burst open seconds later. Male, late 40s, a paramedic shouted. Collapsed at work. Sudden onset chest pain, shortness of breath, altered mental status. The gurney slammed into Bay 3. The patient was pale, sweat-soaked, gasping like he couldn't pull air deep enough no matter how hard he tried. His eyes darted wildly, unfocused. Vitals. The attending physician, Dr. Alan Reeves, demanded. BP 90 over 60 and falling, heart rate 130, O2 sats 88. Lee moved automatically, sliding into position at the head of the bed, adjusting oxygen, watching the patient's chest, not the monitor. That's when she saw it. The rise wasn't even. His left side barely moved. She frowned slightly. Let's get labs, EKG, chest x-ray, Reeves barked. Possible MI. The room filled with motion, orders fired, hands moving, machines rolling in. Lee placed her fingers lightly at the patient's neck, feeling the pulse. Fast, thready, compressed. Her eyes flicked to the veins along his neck, distended. That didn't match a heart attack. She leaned closer, listening with her stethoscope. Right lung, air moving, left lung, almost nothing. Her stomach tightened. She looked at the clock on the wall. 9:46 p.m., 4 minutes gone. Doctor, Lee said calmly, keeping her voice low, something's not right. Reeves didn't look at her. We're working. He's not ventilating evenly, she said. And his neck veins. Lee, Reeves cut in sharply, we're not diagnosing off vibes. A resident snorted quietly. Lee didn't react. She watched the patient instead. His breathing grew more frantic. His chest heaved, but the air didn't seem to help. The monitor alarmed, oxygen dropping. Bag him, Reeves ordered. Prep for intubation. Lee hesitated, bagging increased pressure. She'd seen this before, not often, but enough. She stepped closer. Doctor, if we bag him, we might make it worse. Reeves finally turned toward her, irritation clear on his face. What's your differential, Nurse Morgan? Tension pneumothorax, she said evenly. The room paused. A few heads turned. Reeves scoffed. That's a stretch. He has no trauma. It doesn't require trauma, Lee replied. Just pressure. Reeves shook his head. Chest x-ray will confirm. Lee glanced at the clock again. 9:49 p.m., 7 minutes since arrival. She swallowed. By the time imaging comes back, she said quietly, he may not have a pulse. The resident laughed nervously. She's being dramatic. The patient suddenly convulsed. The monitor screamed. Oxygen dropped into the 70s. Jesus, what's happening? Someone shouted. Reeves swore. Intubate now. Lee stepped forward instinctively. Stop, she said. Give me 8 minutes. Reeves stared at her. 8 minutes we don't have. We do, Lee interrupted, voice steady but firm. If I'm right. The room went still. Reeves looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You're asking me to delay definitive care based on a nurse's hunch. Lee met his gaze. No, she said. I'm asking you to let me fix the real problem. A beat passed, another alarm blared, the patient gasped, then slumped. BP's crashing, the resident yelled, Reeves cursed. He looked between the monitors and Lee. Fine, he snapped. 8 minutes, that's all you get. Lee nodded once. She moved fast, but not frantic. She grabbed a needle from the tray, positioning herself with practiced precision. What is she doing? Someone whispered. Lee didn't answer. She placed her fingers carefully, counting ribs under her breath. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Her hands didn't shake. The clock ticked loudly in her ears. 9:50 p.m. She inserted the needle. There was a sharp hiss. Air rushed out violently. The sound was unmistakable. The room froze. The monitor changed. Oxygen climbed. Heart rate slowed. The patient inhaled deeply for the first time since arriving, a full breath. Silence swallowed the trauma bay. Someone whispered, "Oh my God!" Reeves stared at the monitor, stunned. "What just happened?" he murmured. Lee stepped back slightly, eyes still on the patient. "Tension pneumothorax," she said softly. Relieved. The clock read 9:50 p.m. 8 minutes, exactly. And Act 1 ended with the moment no one in that ER would ever forget. The quiet nurse they ignored had just saved a life. While the doctors were still waiting for confirmation. For a few seconds after the hiss of escaping air, no one spoke. The trauma bay felt suspended in time, monitors beeping at a calmer rhythm, the patient's chest finally rising evenly, the smell of antiseptic and adrenaline hanging thick in the air. Dr. Alan Reeves was still staring at the monitor like it had betrayed him. "That shouldn't have worked," one of the residents muttered, but it had. The oxygen saturation climbed into the 90s, the heart rate slowed. Color returned to the patient's face, replacing the gray panic that had filled the room minutes earlier. Nurse Lee Morgan didn't celebrate. She didn't look around for validation. She stayed focused, stabilizing the needle, watching for recoil, listening to breath sounds again. "Prep a chest tube," she said calmly. "We need something more permanent." The resident hesitated, then looked at Dr. Reeves. Reeves blinked hard, snapping out of his daze. "Yes, yes, do that." His voice sounded different now, lower, careful. As the room resumed motion, whispers rippled through the staff. She called it. In 8 minutes. I didn't even see that. Lee heard none of it. She was watching the patient. 5 minutes later, the crisis had stabilized, but the tension hadn't. Reeves stepped aside near the counter, running a hand through his hair. "That was reckless," he said quietly, though his tone lacked conviction. "You could have punctured his lung, his heart." Lee met his eyes. "He was dying," she replied. "Waiting would have killed him." Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't argue. That unsettled him more than being wrong. As the chest tube was secured and the patient sedated, the ER doors opened again. This time, it wasn't another trauma. It was administration. Dr. Cynthia Park, the ER medical director, entered briskly, tablet in hand. "I heard we had an incident in Bay 3, she said. Reeves straightened immediately. "Situation S under control." Park glanced at the monitor, then at the patient, then at the equipment still scattered around the bed. "Who performed the needle decompression?" she asked. The room went quiet. Reeves hesitated. Lee didn't step forward. She didn't have to. "She did," the resident said, nodding toward Lee. "Nurse Morgan." Park's eyebrows lifted. "A nurse," she said. Lee felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, not guilt, but the weight of being judged after the fact. "Yes," Lee said evenly. "I identified a tension pneumothorax and relieved it." Park looked at Reeves. "You authorized this?" Reeves hesitated just long enough to tell the truth without saying it. "I gave her 8 minutes." Park's lips pressed together. "That's highly irregular." "So is a patient surviving?" Lee said quietly. Park turned back to her, surprised by the directness. You broke protocol, Park said. I followed physiology, Lee replied. Another pause. Park glanced at the monitor again. Stable, improved. She exhaled slowly. We'll discuss this later, she said. For now, good work. The words sounded reluctant, but they landed. An hour later, the ER returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing felt usual anymore. Lee documented every step meticulously, timestamps, observations, reasoning. She knew how this went. When a nurse was right against the system, paperwork became a battlefield. As she typed, Reeves hovered nearby, clearly restless. You were confident, he said finally, from the start. Lee shrugged. I've seen it before. Where? Reeves asked. She paused. Here, she said, and places like it. Reeves studied her. You didn't hesitate. I did, Lee replied. I just didn't let it stop me. Reeves nodded slowly. At 11:07 p.m., the patient's labs returned. They confirmed what Lee had suspected, not a heart attack, not a panic event. A rapidly progressing collapse that would have killed him if pressure hadn't been relieved. The resident stared at the results. She was right, he whispered. Reeves closed his eyes briefly. Word spread fast in the ER, not as gossip, but as disbelief. 8 minutes. No imaging, no consults, no committee, just observation and action. Some doctors were impressed. Others were defensive. One attending muttered, she got lucky. Lee heard that too. She didn't respond. Luck doesn't sound like escaping air. Near midnight, Park returned with a clipboard. Nurse Morgan, she said, walk me through your thinking. Lee did, step by step. No drama, no ego, just facts. Park listened carefully this time. When Lee finished, Park nodded once. You acted appropriately, she said, but this will raise questions. Lee met her gaze. It should, she said. Park studied her, then said quietly, you made some people uncomfortable tonight. Lee smiled faintly. Good. As the shift wore on, the patient remained stable, transferred to ICU, breathing supported. Alive, Reeves stopped by before heading out. I owe you, he said awkwardly. Lee shook her head. You owe the patient. Reeves nodded. Still, thank you. He hesitated. You know this will be reviewed. I know, Lee said, and you're okay with that? Lee looked toward the ICU doors. I didn't do it to be okay, she said. I did it because it was right. Reeves let out a slow breath. That's what scares people, he said. Lee smiled faintly. It shouldn't. As Lee finished her shift, she glanced once more at the trauma bay. 8 minutes. That's all it had taken. Not because she was smarter, not because she was braver, but because everyone else had been looking at screens and she'd been watching the patient. And Act 2 ended with an uncomfortable truth settling into the like a second shift change. Expertise doesn't fail because it lacks knowledge. It fails when it stops paying attention. The ER didn't applaud, it absorbed. That was how Mercy Valley handled moments it didn't know what to do with, by swallowing them whole and moving on as if nothing seismic had just happened. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Nurse Lee Morgan felt it immediately. The way conversations paused when she walked past. The way residents stopped joking and started watching. The way Dr. Alan Reeves avoided her eyes, not out of anger but uncertainty, because competence that comes from the wrong place is unsettling. At 12:18 a.m. Lee was restocking a supply cart when a sharp alarm cut through the ER again. Different bay, different patient, but the sound hit everyone the same way. Respiratory distress in Bay 6. Lee's head snapped up. She was already moving before her cart fully stopped. Inside Bay 6, a young woman lay curled on the bed, gasping shallowly. Her lips were tinged blue. Panic radiated from her body. What happened? Reeves asked, stepping in behind Lee. Shortness of breath, the resident replied. Asthma history, nebulizer didn't help. Lee watched the woman's chest. Same pattern, uneven rise, her stomach dropped. Check breath sounds, Lee said. The resident listened quickly. Wheezing, Lee leaned in herself, right side, air movement, left side, reduced, not absent, reduced. Her pulse quickened. She looked at Reeves. This is starting the same way, she said. Reeves stiffened. You think it's another? I think we shouldn't assume it's asthma, Lee replied. The resident frowned. Statistically, Lee cut him off gently, statistics don't breathe. The woman suddenly clutched her chest, eyes wide. I can't, she gasped. I can't, the monitor screamed. Oxygen dropped. Reeves swore. Bag her. Lee stepped forward. Wait, she said. The room froze. Again, Reeves stared at her. You're asking me to pause again, he said. I'm asking you to look again, Lee replied. The woman's breathing worsened. Seconds passed. The ER clock ticked loudly on the wall. 12:21 a.m. 3 minutes into the second countdown, Reeves looked at the woman, then at Lee. What do you see? He asked quietly. Lee exhaled slowly. I see a pattern, she said, and I see us about to repeat a mistake. Reeves nodded once. Do it, he said. Lee didn't smile, she didn't rush. She moved with the same calm precision as before, assessing, positioning, listening. This time the resident watched closely. Lee placed her fingers carefully. This isn't protocol, the resident whispered. Lee answered without looking at him. Neither is watching someone suffocate. She inserted the needle. The hiss came again, not as violent but unmistakable. The woman sucked in air, coughing hard. Her oxygen climbed. The room erupted into stunned silence. The resident stared. No way, he whispered. Reeves exhaled slowly, a sound somewhere between relief and disbelief. Twice, he said quietly. Lee withdrew the needle and secured it. Twice, she agreed. The second patient stabilized quickly, faster than the first. Because this time no one wasted time arguing. The ER buzzed not with chaos but with realization. Lee leaned against the counter briefly, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Reeves approached. You changed how I practice medicine tonight, he said. Lee looked up. I didn't mean to. I know, Reeves replied. That's why it worked. At 1:03 a.m., administration returned, not just Dr. Park this time, but risk management, clipboards, serious faces, legal language creeping into clinical space. They gathered in a small conference room just off the ER. Lee sat at the table, hands folded. Reeves sat beside her, not across. That mattered. We need to understand what happened, a risk officer said. Twice. Lee explained again, clear, calm, factual, no exaggeration. When she finished, the room was silent. Dr. Park broke it. She recognized tension physiology before imaging, she said. Both times, the risk officer frowned. That's not standard practice. No, Park agreed, but neither is missing it twice. Reeves leaned forward. If she hadn't acted, he said, we'd be discussing 2 fatalities. That ended the debate. Back on the floor, the ER felt different, quieter, sharper. Residents watched patients instead of screens. Nurses spoke up sooner. And when Lee walked by, no one called her dramatic. They called her careful. At 2:40 a.m., Lee returned to Bay 3 briefly. The first patient slept peacefully in the ICU, chest tube functioning, vitals stable. She adjusted his blanket and stepped back. 8 minutes. That was all it had taken to prove something the ER didn't like admitting. That sometimes the most dangerous moment is when the clock runs out. It's when everyone stops listening. And Act 3 ended with a truth that couldn't be charted but would never be forgotten. Silence saves lives when it belongs to someone who knows exactly what to do with it. By 3:15 a.m., the ER had changed. Not visibly, monitors still beeped, stretchers still rolled, coffee still burned in forgotten mugs, but something deeper had shifted. The hierarchy everyone relied on had cracked just enough to let doubt seep in. And doubt in a hospital was dangerous. Especially for those in charge. Dr. Cynthia Park stood at the central workstation reviewing reports from the night. 2 near-identical cases, 2 rapid interventions, 2 lives saved outside standard protocol. 1 nurse. She looked up as Dr. Alan Reeves approached. You stood by her, Park said quietly. Reeves nodded. Because she was right. Park studied him, twice. Yes, Park exhaled slowly. That puts us in a difficult position. Reeves didn't argue. It puts us in an honest one. At 4:02 a.m., Park called an emergency leadership huddle, not scheduled, not announced. Attendance was mandatory. Medical directors, charge nurses, risk management, hospital legal counsel. and at the end of the table, quiet, composed Nurse Lee Morgan. No white coat, no title upgrade, just presence. Park began without preamble. Tonight, 2 patients survived because Nurse Morgan acted decisively before diagnostic confirmation. A murmur rippled through the room. Legal counsel cleared his throat. That's precisely the concern. Lee remained silent. Park continued. Our protocols exist to protect patients, but they also assume recognition happens fast enough. The risk officer leaned forward, and tonight it didn't. Eyes shifted toward Lee. She felt them but didn't shrink. She de-learned long ago that shrinking invited dismissal. The legal counsel spoke again. If this becomes precedent, he said, we open ourselves to liability. Lee finally spoke. Liability doesn't matter to a dead patient, she said calmly. A sharp intake of breath circled the table. Park didn't interrupt. The counsel frowned. That's not how hospitals function. Lee met his gaze. It's how bodies do, she replied. Silence followed, not hostile. Uncomfortable. Reeves leaned forward. We're asking the wrong question, he said. Not did she break protocol. But why didn't protocol catch it in time? Park nodded slowly. That's what worries me, she said, because the answer isn't comfortable. The room absorbed that. At 5:10 a.m., the first patient coded briefly in the ICU. Not a full collapse, but enough. Lee was already there. She adjusted positioning, alerted staff, corrected pressure buildup before it escalated. Crisis avoided. Again. The ICU attending stared at the monitor afterward. You recognized that immediately, he said. Lee nodded. It was the same warning signs. The attending swallowed. I missed it. Lee didn't correct him. She didn't need to. Back in the conference room, the atmosphere shifted from defensive to reflective. Park closed her tablet. We can't ignore this, she said, and we can't punish it. The legal counsel frowned. Then what do you suggest? Park looked at Lee. I suggest we learn, she said, before the next 8 minutes cost us more than pride. As dawn approached, leadership made a decision, not a public one, not yet, but a real one. Protocols would be reviewed, training would change. And Lee's actions would be documented, not as deviation, but as case study. Reeves approached Lee afterward. They're scared, he said quietly. Lee nodded. They should be. Not of you, he clarified. Of what this means. Lee glanced toward the ICU. Meaning doesn't hurt, she said. Ignoring it does. At 6:02 a.m., shift change began. Day staff filtered in, unaware of how close the night had come to disaster. Lee handed off reports calmly, precisely. When she finished, Park stopped her. Walk with me, Park said. They moved down the corridor, footsteps echoing softly. You understand, Park said, this will follow you. Lee met her gaze. It already has, she said. Park paused. You're not interested in advancement, she said. In recognition, Lee shrugged. I'm interested in outcomes. Park smiled faintly. That might be the most disruptive thing you've said all night. As Lee changed out of her scrubs, exhaustion finally settled into her bones. Not the good kind. The deep kind that followed holding steady under pressure. She sat for a moment in the locker room, breathing slowly. 8 minutes. That's what it had taken to expose a weakness no one wanted to see. Not incompetence, complacency. And Act 4 ended with a realization spreading quietly through Mercy Valley's halls. Authority doesn't collapse when it's challenged. It collapses when it refuses to learn. Morning arrived at Mercy Valley Emergency Department without ceremony. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows, soft and indifferent, touching floors that hours earlier had been slick with urgency. The night shift was ending, but its weight remained. Nurse Lee Morgan stood at the ICU doorway one last time before leaving. Both patients were stable. Monitors hummed in steady rhythms, no alarms, no warnings, alive. That was enough. She turned to go. Lee. She stopped. Dr. Alan Reeves stood behind her holding 2 coffees, one untouched. For the drive home, he said, offering it. She took it with a nod. Thank you, she said. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the ICU through the glass. You changed something, Reeves said finally. Lee shook her head. I didn't change anything, I just listened. Reeves smiled faintly. That's what scares people. 2 days later, a quiet memo circulated through Mercy Valley. No headlines, no press release, just a procedural update. Early recognition of tension physiology is now mandatory training for all ER staff. Observation precedes imaging. Lee read it once, then closed it. She didn't pin it to the board. She didn't save the email. She'd already moved on. The following week, Lee was working another night shift when a new resident hesitated beside her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course," Lee replied. "How did you know?" he asked. "Before anyone else." Lee thought for a moment. "Because I wasn't trying to be right," she said. "I was trying to understand what the body was saying." The resident nodded slowly. "I hope I learned that." Lee smiled. "You will if you listen." Later that night, Dr. Park stopped by the ER floor. She stood beside Lee, watching the controlled chaos from a distance. "You could have taken credit," Park said. Lee shrugged. "Credit doesn't help the next patient." Park studied her. "We're revising training," she said. "Your case will be used." Lee met her eyes. "Good," she said. "Then it wasn't just an exception." Park nodded. "That's the point," she said. Months passed. The story didn't spread beyond Mercy Valley, but its impact did. ER response times improved. Complication rates dropped. Staff spoke up sooner. And when a quiet nurse raised a concern, people paused. Listened. One evening, Lee found herself back in Bay 3, the same room where it had all begun. A different patient. A different night. But the same clock on the wall. She glanced at it. 8 minutes, not a deadline, a reminder. As she finished her shift, Lee walked past the nurse's station. A note had been taped to the board. "Thank you for listening when it mattered. No name, no explanation." She smiled softly. Lee stepped outside into the cool night air, coffee in hand. She wasn't famous. She wasn't promoted. She wasn't praised publicly, but she'd done something better. She left the ER safer than she found it. And Act 5 ended with a truth that stayed long after the alarms faded. The most powerful change in medicine doesn't come from authority. It comes from the person willing to notice when time is running out and act before the silence becomes permanent.